Basically, you've heard this morning about the law and the necessity for compliance. So I'm not going to look at that. We all know we have to comply. What I'm going to look at now is how, as an organization. What is an anti-bribery management system? Quite simply, it's a series of policies and procedures which a company must put into effect to ensure that it complies with the law. And, critically, if there is a failure in that system and bribery does take place, either against or on behalf of the company, then the system will ensure the company acts to investigate and deal with that bribery and puts in place preventive measures to stop it happening again. That is an anti-bribery management system. Why do we need such a thing? An organization doesn't really exist other than through its employees. It is a legal concept, and employees act. They are what the company is. And unless you're an organization of one person, you have to have various controls in place that your employees understand what they can and what they cannot do, and systems to control how they do it. It's a bit like, you can't say to someone, we will have no bribery. And as Monty said, you can't put it in the drawer and then go home. You have to do more than that. There's a huge equivalence to safety. I think if you go back 20 or 30 years in safety, people would aspire to matching the market norms in construction. So if the market norm was one person died per kilometre of road built and 20 people were injured in a particular country, you tried not to be worse than that. Until some inspired leaders came along and said, we must have 0 deaths, 0 harm on site. And people argued and said, how can you have 0 deaths, 0 harm? You're going to have an accident. But you have to aim for 0, otherwise, what is acceptable? 1 death, is that tolerable? And so therefore, only by training people on site, giving people helmets, safety gear, harnesses, by having inspectors stopping breaches on site, by having inspectors and prosecutors imprisoning people, only by a systematic series of controls have we actually managed to get a grip on site safety and improve fundamentally the safety on site. And bribery prevention has a strong equivalence to safety management and quality management. You can prevent bribery only by systematic controls in your organisation. I've been in this industry a long time, and I share Monty's amazement and frustration at how in the last few years suddenly the whole country is full of experts who I never saw 10 years ago. But you have to have these systematic controls in place. So really, where did this all come from? It goes back further than the Bribery Act. Some people will be surprised to know. It's an international issue going back a long time. And certainly when I joined the sector in the 1980s internationally, I was one of the people who were told bribery is normal, it's a part of business. If we in Britain don't bribe in countries A, B, C, we will lose the work. And we have to do it because the Germans, the French, and the Americans are doing it. When you start working with the Germans and the French and the Americans, and they say, well, we have to do it because the Brits do it. Yeah. And it's only when you think, can we short-circuit that circle and stop the whole problem at source from the supply side end and also from the demand side end, can you get anywhere? And so, looking back quite a long way, the first real move to stop bribery started with organisations like TI and the OECD in the 1980s, 1990s. But critically, the turning point, legally, were the whole space of international conventions, like the UN Convention Against Corruption, the OECD Convention, etc., the Inter-American Convention, the African Union Convention. Every region has an anti-corruption convention. So basically we have a situation now where at least 160 countries have signed up to various conventions saying bribery is illegal, it is a crime, we will put prosecution in place to stop it, we will ensure our laws prohibit it, we will cooperate with other countries. No longer anywhere can you say it's just part of the culture, it's something people does, don't worry about it. It is internationally illegal. And that's a very different point from saying, do countries enforce the law? That's a very, very different point. It is illegal, whether or not the law is enforced in certain countries. This spate of conventions required countries to change their laws to be consistent with the conventions. And to my knowledge, most countries now have laws in place which are consistent with conventions. And now, as has been pointed out earlier, a lot of prosecutions are beginning very slowly to take place. So you have a legal environment where the conventions say it must be illegal, the laws say it is illegal, the prosecutors are starting to prosecute. Therefore, an organisation has to comply with this environment. Ethically, it must comply, but legally, it must comply. And so you started having, about 10 years ago, a lot of companies saying, how do we comply with this changing legal environment? And you've got organisations like TI publishing the business principles against bribery, the OECD published its guidelines, the ICC published its guidelines, and there was the DOJ guidelines as well. And so there was a whole space of guidance published internationally, which began to bring together people's concepts of international best practice. Until sitting here today, we are pretty damn sure what you have to do to stop bribery. There's no one answer to everything. These approaches have to be flexible, but we know what systems and controls have to be put in place. And so inevitably, almost, we move towards a standard. Because if you have an international acceptance of what has to be done, if you have a lot of guidance saying how you do it, the question then comes, well, we know what is to be done. We want to make sure we work with suppliers and subcontractors who are also doing it. How are we sure? The standard is the obvious mechanism. An independently verifiable, certifiable, measurable standard, which can be produced, is, to my mind, a significant step forward. Nothing is the answer. That's a huge quantum leap in preventing bribery worldwide. And so, luckily, in 2010, BSI bit the bullet and said, we would like to adopt an anti-bribery standard. Is there a market need for it? We worked with a large group of stakeholders at BSI. I was appointed chairman of their drafting group. We had a superb group of 30 people working on the standard, and I think we got it from scratch to publication in about 10 months, I think, from memory, which was quite quick. Very uncontroversial development, because people knew what had to be done. Published in 2010, and we then had a gap, because companies said, okay, this is great, how do we get certification to it? There were no certifiers. So we spoke to the certifiers who said, we will certify as long as there's a market. And the company said, we want to certify before we adopt the standards. And Maybe Bridge became the first company in the UK to get certified in July last year. Since then, Mott MacDonald has recently been certified. I'm not aware of what the figures are, but I am aware of a huge move towards companies to firstly adopt it, because you don't need to certify to the standard, you can just adopt it and measure yourself internally. But secondly, to get an independent certification. So that is where we are in relation to the standard. And I want to come to the international elements in a short while. But just briefly, what does the standard involve? What does it require you to do? I am totally, unequivocally biased in favour of the standard, as one of the sort of co-authors and developers of it. I think it works. I'm sure it can be improved in due course. There are points like Monty pointed out, which we need to focus on to improve. But it works. I've seen it work in several companies. Every statement in that standard, I believe, is measurable, achievable, verifiable. And that is the key to the standard. But you can't just look at the standard and tick a box and say we do that, because the standard doesn't allow that. The standard requires you to put in place reasonable and proportionate procedures to help you prevent bribery. And there are a large number of steps to help you do so. Nothing in there uncontroversial, I think. It requires the board of directors to take the leadership, the responsibility to say, we will have no bribery in this company. If we find bribery, we will deal with it appropriately and investigate it and take steps to prevent recurrence. We will appoint a manager responsible for compliance. Now, some small companies cannot, of course, have a standalone independent manager, and that's why the problem of independence comes in, because a small organisation of 5 or 6 people cannot afford to have one compliance manager full-time, so therefore the role has to be combined with other roles. I think Steve will discuss later. There needs to be training of the staff so that they understand what bribery is, what they do when faced with bribery, who to report to, how to avoid it. You need proper commercial controls in place to prevent bribery. How do you control your supply chain through competitive tendering? How do you actually ensure that your people, your procurement staff, are not being bribed? How do you control certificates, approvals of work to prevent bribery? You need financial controls in place. How do you control the money? Check signatories, financial approvals. You need contractual controls, contract clauses which actually prohibit bribery with all the people you're doing business with. You need employee vetting. Make sure your employees are good, honest employees, that their CVs check out, that they are committed contractually not to enter into any bribery in the organisation. Disciplinary procedures to deal with them if they do breach your guidelines. You need a whistleblowing reporting hotline so employees can report any suspicion of corruption. You need an investigation procedure so your company will investigate and deal with any element of bribery. But the most tricky process in all this, which I think the BSI tries to take head on, and I think we're ahead of most other guidance in this regard, is due diligence. How do you deal with your supply chain? This is the key issue. If a subcontractor or joint venture partner or an agent can cause us, the organisation, to be convicted through failure to have adequate procedures, what do we actually realistically have to do to prevent bribery by them? What due diligence do we have to do on them? What risk assessments do we have to do? How far do we have to go to ensure that those companies themselves have adequate anti-corruption measures in place? I don't have time to go into those details now, but the British Standard tries to hit that head on to make sure an organisation has proper procedures in place to undertake risk assessments and do due diligence on your supply chain and on your customers, and take reasonable steps to ensure that they have procedures in place to prevent bribery. So I think it is a very strong template in order to put an anti-bribery system in place. And having worked with numerous companies over the last few years who are working to it, it definitely can be done. We piloted it on Balfour Beatty, who have 55,000 people in about 100 countries. They are compliant with BS 10,500. They could do it. Going down the chain in size, maybe Bridge, 550 people, a manufacturing company exporting to over 100 countries. They can do it. They have been certified to BS 10,500. And at the smallest end of the spectrum in our piloting, Steve Walker will talk shortly, an estate agency in the UK and an optical consultancy in the UK, each with 15 employees, were piloted. They also could do it. So we proved that the standard was proportionate and could be adopted by a company with 55,000 employees down to a company with 15 employees. The key to it is that it is scalable, and that everything you do to comply with the standard must be reasonable and proportionate. So therefore, I think having seen the standard being quite successful, the question is, how does that relate into the UK Bribery Act? The standard was not published as a standard to give you protection under the UK Bribery Act. That was not its purpose. It is an anti-bribery standard usable anywhere in the world by British companies or other countries trading in the UK or anywhere. But in drafting it, we paid very careful attention to the UK Bribery Act and to the adequate procedures issue in particular. And we firmly believe that if the company does properly implement BS 10,500, we strongly believe that that will be very good evidence that you have implemented adequate procedures as a defence under the UK Act. But if you fundamentally breach the standard, it will not give you a defence. It will only give you a defence if you've really done your best and a rogue employee or a rogue subcontractor, despite all your best efforts, has gone off and paid a bribe. Then I think the prosecution will say, you did your best, you did everything reasonable, you've got certified, there's been a rogue, there will always be a rogue. Have you dealt with it appropriately? Yes, you have. You're okay. But if there's evidence the board ignored the standard, put it in the drawer, and there's a major breach with some form of corporate responsibility, the standard will offer no defence whatsoever, and that's common sense. The final point, therefore, is where next. I think in the UK, often companies tend to say, we in the UK, it's all very well, we comply with this act, and no one else in the world does so. It's totally wrong. It's not true. A lot of countries in the world are grappling with this problem. A lot of companies are grappling with this problem internationally. We haven't got the most stringent anti-bribery laws in the world. There are countries with stronger. It is strong. It is being enforced, which is very welcome. But in developing an international standard, it's been very gratifying and interesting to see how much international support and drive there is for an international standard. And I've been appointed chairman of the International Standardization Organization, ISO's Anti-Bribery Working Group. We've been tasked with forming an anti-bribery standard as an ISO. It's being led by BSI, called the Secretariat, and we had our first meeting last week in the UK. When BSI submitted the proposal to ISO that there should be an international standard, it was sent out to ISO's 120 member countries. Only 29 countries voted. 19 countries voted in favour, of which countries like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, UK, Canada, New Zealand, Spain, Italy voted in favour. To my enormous surprise, America, France, Germany, Japan and the Netherlands voted against, which I find incomprehensible, on record or off the record. Anyway, we then, because there was a vote of 19 in favour and 8 against, the ISO Technical Management Board approved that a standard would be developed, but they gave it provisional approval because the strength of opposition from the USA in particular was so strong that ISO were reluctant to give it unconditional approval. And so what we had to do at the Secretariat was go through all the numerous objections of the objecting countries at a meeting in London last week and deal with the questions adequately. Fortunately, last week we had very powerful support from the UK, Tunisia, Switzerland, Sweden, Malaysia, and Nigeria, thank you. And we also had written, and Israel as well, very powerful support. We had strong opposition from America and France in the meeting. But after 3 days, very tough negotiation and talking, we finally came to a consensus that we would proceed with the international standard, that a working group should continue to develop the standard. The standard should be limited to bribery for the time being, and it should be a standalone standard. That was a great breakthrough, and now it's going to be balloted to all the international ISO members. There'll be a vote in the ISO Technical Board, I think in October, and assuming all goes well, an ISO Technical Board approve it, then a 2 or 3 year process will be put in place under which we have to develop an international anti-bribery standard. I believe we will get there. It's not going to be easy because even if we get approval to go ahead, we've got the drafting. How do you agree a standard with 120 countries? That's going to be an interesting process. But I believe firmly that the tide is very, very strongly in favour of an international standard. And I think that something's turned, something has changed. And we're going to start seeing procurement agencies saying, we want all our contractors in building this road to be certified to 9001, 14001, 18001 and 10500. And as soon as that happens, the main contractors will say, well, to comply with that standard, we have to make sure our subcontractors and suppliers are also certified to that standard. So I think you will see a cascade coming through the industry, and it can only help to raise the standards. It's not the solution, but I think it's an enormous contribution and a great leap forward. It's doable, it's achievable. Thank you very much.